Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is March 23rd, and we're entering day 24 of this conflict with Iran. And right before we started recording, you said that you wanted to give an update about Lebanon. So let's start with that, and then we'll bounce off to everything else.
Okay, yeah, we'll get to Iran quickly. There's obviously very dramatic developments on that front, but we do need to mention Lebanon. I mean, that's I think it was last Wednesday that I said that the Israelis had called up 45,000 reserves. That was incorrect. Actually, it's 450,000 reserves. So that's a major operation. Again, we're talking about. This is a population of just about 8 million Jews, right? So we're talking about 1/16 of the population, basically, for this is being called up for it, and it's already begun. There have been ground incursions. They haven't gone very well. Again, they find it difficult when they get on the ground and they face Hezbollah. Hezbollah always proves to be, a very formidable opponent, and they were hoping that. The loss of Syria and the decapitation strikes earlier had severely weakened Hezbollah. I think it's fair to say it weakened them, but not severely. They have reconstituted themselves and they remain a formidable force. But that doesn't mean that Israel hasn't dealt a great deal of death and destruction in Lebanon since the end of the ceasefire, which the Israelis never kept. Let's be honest about that. They didn't even. It's been described as the most violated ceasefire in the history of the world. But since the ceasefire, so-called, ended pretty much with the beginning of the war against Iran, 1,200, over 1,200. Lebanese have been killed, many of them civilians. I think there's at least 100 children have been killed and many, many homes demolished. And what's even more alarming is that the Israelis are talking about essentially just seizing the land south of the Litani River. And it was the defense minister, Israel Katz, who said that we're going to give them the Gaza treatment, essentially. He didn't use those exact words, but he said we're going to do to southern Lebanon what we did to Rafah and to other places within Gaza. We're going to just level them. So the plan is to level everything. And they had begun this actually during the so-called ceasefire. They demolished something, tens of thousands of homes. And they're continuing to do that now. So many of these are centuries old villages. They don't care. They're demolishing them all. And it looks like, they've declared that they're going to create the Israeli military. The IDF has declared that they're going to create a forward defense zone, words to that effect, in southern Lebanon all the way to the Litani River. Now, that's the kind of the more neutral let's say bureaucratic language that the IDF is using, but within the Knesset, within Israeli society and Israeli politics, they're talking about expanding Israel, seizing that territory and settling it. That's something that came up. That was actually something that was never even talked about. There's always talk about taking, the West Bank and to a lesser extent Gaza before. And obviously that project was underway in the West Bank for many, many years. But there wasn't any sort of conversation or discussion about settling southern Lebanon. But that began a couple of years ago, kind of on the fringes, but now it's moving towards the mainstream. And now we see the IDF actually doing it. That's how it works. Like when the Israelis took the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, they didn't say outright, we're going to settle this. It was just it's a buffer zone. And then the settlers started to move in and gradually the whole thing became transformed. So anyway, that's what we're seeing in Lebanon. There was a lot of talk earlier, it has since faded away, about maybe the Syrians under al-Shara, previously al-Jalani, moving in and working with the Israelis. And apparently a lot of pressure was put on him to do it. Now, interestingly, according to Craig Murray, who has a number of sources in the region, he says that his sources tell him that it was actually the Turkish President Erdogan, who just, which countermanded those orders, you could say, essentially told al-Jilani, don't go in. And he's the one who he's basically, you could say al-Jilani, al-Shara is the puppet of Erdogan. Yeah, Erdogan was really the one who put him in place. Now, why would that be? Again, I think we have to go back and say that, yeah, like Israel and Iran have been at odds, especially in Syria, but you can say that Turkey won in Syria. And now they don't care. Now they're looking at the larger picture, and they see that if Iran falls, they're probably next on the list. And there are Israelis who are saying that, and that's not officially declared, but they understand that that's a possibility. The Israeli doctrine is just that we can't have any powerful rivals in the region. That their idea of security is just to be surrounded by countries in chaos, weak countries in civil war, countries that are that have been destroyed or partially destroyed. That's the thing. And say, okay, Iran goes, hey, we're next on the list. Yes, certainly Turkey has cooperated under the table and continues to do that with Israel, but they are still a rival. And I think that's the reason that Turkey is remaining, does not want to see a total victory for Israel.
Well, how did this doctrine get in place from the Israelis? This short-sighted doctrine of just total domination. You can't have any rivals. Because it is so short-sighted. I just don't understand how that got approved and accepted, that the idea is that for indefinitely, we're just going to be attacking everybody forever to make sure that they never prosper,
right.
They never succeed, they never, establish relations with other countries or whatever it is. These are supposed to be smart people, right? I just don't understand how that you could have had such an idiotic doctrine like that. Like, isn't it better to make friends with people? I mean,
yeah, well, it goes way back. I mean, I think it was Jabotovsky. Was one of actually. What is he? He's related to. He may even be like the Netanyahu's father or father. I can't remember. He's a close relation of Netanyahu. But he was, part of the earliest Zionist movement, and he spoke of the Iron Wall. It's just like, what we have to do is make them fear us. So that has always been that strain. It's just that we use military might, and we just have to really destroy the enemy to the point where they don't dare to raise their head. And so that's always been there, but it hasn't. I think it came to the fore probably in the 1990s. There was a paper that was published by Douglas Faith and who was the other guy? He was one of these neocons that got us into the Iraq War, but it was called a clean break, and it did just describe this doctrine. It said that this is what we do. We need to encourage. We need to take down all of our rivals, and you can say that they've succeeded in doing that. When that paper was published, Saddam Hussein was very much in power. Assad was very much in power. They're both gone. And now you can see, okay, Iraq, well, they're using Iraq. They have the U.S. military has bases there, and Israeli and American planes, use that airspace to fire into Iran. Iran is the next one on the list, and I think probably after that it wasn't included in the list provided in a clean break, but Turkey, would be the next one again. I would say that again, that paper was published in the 1990s. It was the unipolar moment, and so it was kind of an outgrowth of that unipolar hubris. We can do what we want. We don't have to negotiate. We simply can just destroy.
Yeah, I mean the fatal flaw of this doctrine is that when you're no longer able to enforce it, then these other countries, when they go attack you, there's not going to be any remorse. You showed them no mercy for so long, and you were so cruel and barbaric for so long against these countries that when it gets turned, the tables turn, and now you're in trouble. And we're seeing it already. They're crying for help. Look at these war crimes. And everyone's like, yeah, no, it's the boy who cried wolf. You said this, you lied to us again and again and again. And now it's actually not the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah, not
at all. But you know what I mean? It's just,
right.
So I just, it's going to be catastrophic for them. And there is not going to be any sympathy when they're getting hit now, and people, people, I don't like saying it, but people are happy. People are glad. Like, here's a taste of
Yeah,
your
it's
own
hard
medicine.
not to feel some kind of satisfaction. I have to temper it because I know real people were being killed or severely injured, their homes destroyed. I guess in a way I can't feel sorry about their homes being destroyed after all, but I don't want to see people die. Even if they are extreme Zionists, and I'm sure the majority of them are. I don't want to see people die. They still are human beings, and they have their families, and they. So anyway, you know what I mean. But it isn't certainly at a certain level not to feel a certain sense of satisfaction, and I think it is important for Israelis to understand that they are not invulnerable. I think that's part of the problem. They kind of developed a sense of invulnerability. Now the danger is that they start to feel vulnerable. They felt vulnerable after the October 7th attack, and you see what they did. If they start to feel vulnerable again, and I think we're starting to see that, especially after these attacks on Dimona and Arad, that we'll discuss in more detail soon. If that goes too far, then, how are they going to respond? That's the danger. It's just like, their reaction always is, okay, oops, the enemy is hurting us. We can't let this happen. We have to demonstrate that we're in control. What can we do? And conventional means are not sufficient. Do we go nuclear? That's the real danger.
Right. Okay, just a few things just on the Lebanon front. Do you see a potential for a civil war within Lebanon? Because Lebanon's a weird country. You have Hezbollah, and then you have like the Lebanese army, which is just basically paid off by the United States to do Israel's bidding. So,
right,
where do you see this going? I mean,
I don't think so. I think Hezbollah is simply too strong. Hezbollah is for real. And the Lebanese army, the official army, which is, again, funded by the U.S., is not for real. They are a true paper tiger. Now, there are various factions, but I don't think, I don't think that they're going to actually take on Hezbollah because, again, Hezbollah is a powerful force, and the majority of the population supports them. Now, they certainly are being encouraged, of course. The Israelis want them to do, and the Americans want them to take on Hezbollah. And that they're probably doing their best to twist arms and tempt them. But we saw how that failed with the Kurds, at least so far. And I think so far we can say the same about Lebanon, at least to the present and the foreseeable future.
mm. Has there been any condemnation from the Western media, what they see Israel doing in Lebanon, just taking land here? I mean, this isn't there wasn't a Palestinian state, but Lebanon is a country. It is a sovereign country
Right.
with borders, and they're just disregarding it and just demolishing, you said, tens of thousands of homes, threatening to
Right.
do the Gaza treatment to southern Lebanon. Surely the West at this point can say like, "Whoa, wait, hey, that's not okay," right?
There have been muted criticisms. I think even Macron, actually criticized Israel. But, he does that, and the others do from time to time. But these criticisms never are meaningless because they're never backed up with any real action. So there have been mild criticism. In general, it's been ignored. As a part of this campaign to take everything south of the Litani River, the Israelis have been taking out the bridges across the Litani River, for obvious reasons. And we saw that actually quite vividly. There was an RT reporter. He was a British citizen who was standing close to one of these bridges, and then you see it on tape. He can hear the missile incoming and makes a dash for it, and then bam, he ended up suffering, not insignificant injuries, and I think the cameraman too. But there's no condemnation. You would think that this is a British citizen, but of course, they considered him a traitor working for RT, so nothing was. Again, his vehicle, he himself clearly marked his press, but we know that if it was any other country, I'd say, okay, maybe it was a mistake. And I think that you have to start from there when you examine a case. Probably a mistake. Look at it more closely. Let's investigate this. But in the case of Israel, I think we have to start with the assumption that it was intentional because they have this history of targeting press. It's well known, like Israel's killed more members of the press than any country, and since records have started taking, the record keeping of this began. In Gaza alone, I believe 250 members of the press have been killed. And obviously, a great number of them, if not the majority, were killed intentionally, were targeted.
Yeah. I think we've gotten to this point now where everybody realizes that Israel is the bad guy around the world. And even though that mainstream media won't report things correctly and cover it, it's just like there was this thing from Bloomberg. Bloomberg reported that President Trump's decision to wage war was influenced by outside allies. Oh, really? Outside allies? Who they don't name it, but we all know, right? We all know. Like we're playing this crazy game. They'll be like, oh, yeah, there were journalists that were killed in a strike. Okay, who carried out the strike? Why, what happened? It's gotten just to a ridiculous point for us now that it's just like, we know the dam is broken. Everybody is aware that Israel is the bad guy. And everybody is aware now that the U.S. is being controlled by Israel, was pushed in by this. It's Bloomberg is reporting that. It's mainstream now. It's just so obvious that even the mainstream media can't hide it completely. They just sort of remove a mention of Israel from the title, and then that's it, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I think, right. You'd have to be a real fool not to, when you see the use of the passive voice, it always is used in the case of Israel. But when you see that, say, oh, Israel, that's why we're using the passive voice in this headline.
Right. So I feel like the jig is up, right? I mean, if we all know, then how do they continue to try to get support? They can't, right? That's the big problem the West has right now, or the U.S. has and Israel has, is they can't generate support for this war. They're trying to do everything they can, and everybody, including things like false flags, but everybody is watching it because everybody knows that this war isn't going well and that they have to drum up supports. What are they going to do? Like there was that whole Diego Garcia mess. You remember you heard that like, oh, Iran's trying to strike Diego Garcia, which is over 4,000 kilometers away, something like that. And it's like, that's way beyond Iran's proposed missile range of 2,000 kilometers. And then there's this big push saying, oh, look, Europe, you got to join this fight and come here and invade Iran for us, because they're going to be targeting Rome next, and Paris and Berlin. Right. That's what it is.
Even London.
Even London. Yeah, just such an absurd claim. Like, why would Iran want to do that? It's just obvious that why Iran is hitting Israel, because you've been attacking them and killing them for decades and decades, and it's just insane. And now we're hearing that these two missiles that were fired at Diego Garcia, they're saying did not come from Iran. And it's like, it's another one of those like, oh, well, I wonder where it came from. We know where it came from. Israel. They're saying possibly an Israeli submarine. I mean, this is NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte says the alliance cannot confirm Israel's claim that missiles targeting Diego Garcia were Iranian intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so...
Right. Yeah, right. And there are other sources that are saying the same thing. And then those reports on the Diego Garcia attack actually came from Israel, from Israeli media, which is very suspicious. You would think that it would come from U.S. media, of course, or British media, because it's a combined U.S.-British base there on Diego Garcia. So, yeah, it looked like it's another attempt by the Israelis to draw in other people. We've seen several of these. In relation to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, I think Oman, there's
another UK base as well, right? Some drone attack, I think.
Okay, on Cyprus, right?
Right. So I mean,
we don't know.
The Israelis have targeted the Brits twice already, and why can't they just say like, well, that's not okay. You can't be doing that, right? I mean,
yeah, they never will. I mean, there's the U.S. and Israel continues to get rhetorical support of some sort anyway. You have the G7 again condemning Iran and which is just ridiculous. Clearly they were the victim in this. They are not the aggressor state. It's just, this is just a clear-cut case, but they can't get themselves to say it. And it's the same is true of the great majority of European countries, with those honorable exceptions like Spain. But yet, they are holding back. I guess the Europeans just see that this is a disaster in the making, and they do not want to be a part of it. So even if they're still afraid to offend Donald Trump and to directly oppose him, again with the honorable exception of Pedro Sanchez in Spain. They aren't going along, and Trump is just getting more and more desperate. He's flailing, he's threatening. He even used the threat of Greenland again. He threatened to take Greenland if the Europeans didn't go in and clean up his mess, which his own Navy is telling him we can't clean up. And it's absurd. And I think we have to get to the 48-hour ultimatum too. That was something that happened after our last episode.
For sure. Yeah. And I just want to say Iran is playing into this well. They tell Europe, don't worry, we will protect you from Trump. But it is true. Who are the people that are attacking Europe? It's the Americans, and it's been the Israelis. The Israelis directly firing missiles at UK bases or firing a drone at a UK base. The US destroying Europe's energy infrastructure and forcing all this stuff on them. We are the ones that are destroying Europe. And Trump just threatening to take Greenland, this part of Denmark, this huge landmass.
Right.
And just saying that I'm going to take it. It's crazy how despite everything, and just the way that Trump treats the Europeans, just how he talks to them, he clearly despises them. This administration thinks very little of Europe, and I understand there's a reason why they think little of the leaders, but it's just you can't just talk to these people all like this constantly. Surely at some point they'll find a backbone and be like, "This is not okay," and maybe not.
Yeah, we sure hope so. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is insane. But it is nice to see that they're at least not just diving headfirst into this war. Reuters had an article saying Britain sees no evidence that Iran is targeting Europe with missiles. Many publications, so they're not falling for this. I think they realize it's so suicidal that they can't do it.
Right. Well, this is the case. We're not seeing a kind of a unified propaganda front in the way that we see in relation to the Ukraine war. Everybody's on board. They're all generating the same propaganda with very occasional exceptions. And those exceptions are ignored. They never become part of the narrative. It's because, again, Trump, like we said, even before this war began, he did not lay the groundwork for it. He did not make a convincing case. It was just, it all happened in a very haphazard and incoherent fashion. So he went into this war without a persuasive case, without getting the populace on board, but also the elites on board, in great contrast to the Iraq war. So from day one, we are seeing some, real, very critical pieces appearing in mainstream media, both in Europe and in the U.S.
Yeah, the whole thing's falling apart. And so maybe that's a good way to segue to this tweet. Maybe we should have started the podcast off with this because this is the big news. But
no, that's fine.
But we started the weekend off with Trump with this 48-hour ultimatum saying if Iran doesn't fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. And thank you for attention, Donald J. Trump. So everybody, I think, was on pins and needles. And before going to bed, I was like, okay, is he going to do this? Because Iran was going to wipe out the energy infrastructure across the Persian Gulf and Israel. This could be catastrophic. And then, so I went to bed thinking this could happen. And then we wake up and we found out he tacoed out, right? He's saying he's pleased to report that the United States of America and the country of Iran have had over the last 2 days very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities in the Middle East. Based on the tenor and tone of these in-depth, detailed, and constructive conversations, which will continue throughout the week, I've instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period, subject to the success of the ongoing meetings and discussions. Thank you for your attention to this matter, Donald J. Trump. But the Iranians are saying, we're not talking to this guy. This is just complete BS. That he's just made this up and because he needs an out. So how do you read this whole thing?
Okay, well, first of all, he does have a history of just making up conversations. Remember, he claimed that he had a conversation with Modi, and Modi told him, "Yeah, I won't buy any more Russian energy." Modi said, "That never happened." The Indian said, "This is not the first time." Actually, when he made that threat, I immediately predicted, I wasn't online or anything, but that he wouldn't follow through on it, because I think he was just shooting from the hip, like he does all the time. He didn't consult with anybody. People will tell him, "Oh, don't do it because the Iranians are going to just totally devastate all those Gulf economies." And then oil, you think the price of oil is high now, it's going to be just much, much worse. And those, anyway, sure enough, well, he did it. He didn't consult with anybody, I don't think. And the Iranians immediately promised to retaliate, with devastating strikes on all these Gulf monarchies, on their energy infrastructure, and also on desalination plants and U.S.-owned companies. And they provided a list. We will hit this, and, So, and again, the Iranians have shown that they're serious when they say these things. They told us what they were going to do before the war began, and they did it. They have established deterrence, and I think that's what happened. Trump saw that list, and he said, "Oh my God," or his advisor says, "You can't let this happen," and he just made up this story about negotiations. Now, it's funny, actually the energy markets, I don't know if they're just stupid people there in the energy markets. They're obviously not stupid people. They know their business, but they may not know geopolitics or, very well. You would think they would. But immediately the price of a barrel of oil dropped from something like 107 down to 97, I think, when I last checked. It dropped $10 approximately, because you say, "Oh, it looks like there may be a resolution to this whole thing." I think that there aren't any talks. Again, the Iranians are denying that any talks are ongoing, that there have been any talks. They're not interested in talking to Witkoff and Kushner anyway. And according to Axios, though, there have been some sort of talks, using Egypt and some other countries as intermediaries. I think that that's just a psyop. I really don't think there have been any talks, and I believe the Iranians on this.
Yeah, well, it seems like Trump clearly wants to throw in the towel. He realized this did not go the way he was expecting it to, and he wants out. Israel, on the other hand, I feel like they should want out, but I'm not exactly sure. Do they want out?
I think they probably went out pretty soon. Again, this was not a war in American interests. It was in Israeli interests. Interestingly, if you look back, before the war began, it was Israel's demands that were being put forth. It really had nothing to do with the U.S. It was, again, support for Iranian allies, the missile program, which can hit Israel but can't hit the U.S. or anything. It was all about Israel. And then after, it's just like somebody told Trump, "Hey, you better talk about America a little bit." And he started saying, "Yeah, we're trying to protect America by doing this. They've been, waging war against us for 47 years. Oh, it's a bunch of nonsense, right? But it's just like an afterthought. Oh, yeah, America. No, I think this was always about Israel. And the Israelis, I think what I hear, actually, there's a recent report in the media that the current head of the Israeli Mossad did try to sell this idea. Maybe he had like that Connie and some other moles, and which allowed him to believe that we have a real chance at carrying out some kind of coup, some sort of regime change. And he said, "If you do this, it's decapitation, but we have our people in place, we can do this." And that intelligence, so-called, got to Trump, and it was part of what persuaded him, apparently. Obviously, it failed. But in the meantime, I think the Israelis had a fallback line. Okay, we can't actually overthrow the government, but we can weaken it. This is part of the playbook. Like what we do, we're mowing the lawn, like we do from time to time in Lebanon and in Gaza, and now we're mowing the lawn in Iran. Isn't that great? We're going to, again, weaken them. We'll degrade their their capabilities, and then every once in a while we'll go back in and we'll weaken them again. Now, I think there's probably some kind of alarm about Iranian resilience. They're finding that, again, this is a country that can fight back, and we saw that over the weekend with the strikes on Dimona and Arad that were and Tel Aviv, that were quite significant. Again, we were told that basically they had wiped out all of Israel's launch not Israel's, but rather Iran's launch capabilities, taken out 80% of the launchers, 90% of the launchers. We're hearing that in the first couple of weeks. Now here we are in the fourth week, and they launched this devastating strike, probably the most devastating strike so far, and we're in the fourth week. And, people are starting to wonder, and I imagine that there are those in Israel saying, this isn't going so well, maybe we should just look for a way out. But there are, and you do get some kind of statements like that from Netanyahu and others to that effect. They don't say, of course they claim great success. When they're saying that we've been completely successful, we've achieved our objectives, that's a way of them saying, we need to get out of here. Okay, we're declaring victory, let's go home. But they're finding that hard to do. And with like these, the more damage that Iran causes to them, the more difficult it is for them to proclaim victory, right? So they're like Trump, I think they're in trouble. They would, if the Iranians were truly weakened and could not really retaliate in a significant way, they probably would be declaring victory and leaving right now. They're finding that hard to do. I think they are looking for a way out, but Iran
won't give them one. They won't give them one.
Yeah. Well, and part of the reason is that, look, it's the Israelis and the Americans deprived Iran of deprived themselves of an off-ramp. Let's put it that way, by using negotiations as a cover for attacks and doing that twice. You do that and you just, and then you start to talk about negotiations again. You have to negotiate an off-ramp. But, but where is your credibility? You destroyed your own credibility. And so you've deprived yourself of an off-ramp. That's where they are.
Yeah. I mean, it's even worse than that. We just, the new supreme leader, the new Ayatollah, we killed his parents. We killed his wife. We killed his children. What do you think he's going to do? Anybody in this position. And when you were negotiating in good faith multiple times, you made so many concessions. You sacrificed so much. You had these sanctions on your country for so long. You took it all. And then they killed your father, your mother, your wife, your kids. Anybody. What how would you behave? How would you react? The U.S. has put themselves in a complete bind, and the problem is that we always assume that we have escalation dominance everywhere in the world. And we saw what happened with Russia. We assumed that we could control the situation of escalation dominance, and then we thought, well, surely we can with Iran. And look at this. You can just look at the map. You can explain to a child how that Iran has a chokehold on the global economy with the Strait of Hormuz. And right now they are choking the U.S., the U.S. empire and Israel. And I think they're going to win. Just their confidence, I think, is growing. The fact that you told me that they providing a list. These are all the targets we're going to hit. They know they can hit them, and they know the U.S. and Israel can't stop it. And I've seen a graph as well of the ballistic missiles and drones that have been fired. It started off really high, obviously, at the beginning, and started declining. And then I think that's when they were saying, yeah, we won, wiped out. And around day 10 or 12 was around the low point. But ever since then, it's been going up. The number of ballistic missiles being fired every day have been going up, and especially the number of drones. That has been going up rapidly. So you just see the trajectory over the past 10 days. Iran is speeding up its attacks, and Israel and the U.S. have no ability to defend themselves. There's been basically every single radar has been destroyed to the Middle East. We're firing blind. We have to do this kind of like last second, interceptions. I saw a video as well in northern Israel where there was 16 seconds between when the air siren started and then the rocket hit. That's where they're at, because they just don't have the ability to even detect these things. And these are small Katyusha rockets. These are things that were like easily intercepted by the Iron Dome over and over again. Now they're just piercing through, and there's only 16 seconds warning before they get hurt. So it's insane. And I think Iran's got this in the bag. I don't see we're just going to watch Trump and Israel squirm and continue to make threats. But the more they do it, the more monstrous we look. And then if we start using the threats of nuclear weapons, more and more false flag attempts, everybody's watching it. Everybody's watching the U.S. and Israel squirm. And everybody knows that Iran is in the right, Israel and the U.S. are in the wrong, and anything that they try to do will be looked at as just an evil, aggressive, expansionist, whatever move that nobody's going to respect. That just criminal.
Yeah, right. No, it looks very grim for the U.S. and Israel. They can continue to do a lot of damage. Apparently, they're doing less damage. I've heard that I think pretty much after 2 weeks, the number of sorties fell off significantly. And now it's much lower than it was at the beginning. And I think that's a sign that they are running out of munitions, and probably their planes too are starting to show wear and tear. Again, the F-35 it's a very formidable aircraft when it's operating well and it's well maintained, but it is a very fragile aircraft. It requires a lot of maintenance, and even during peacetime, it's something that's generally well below 50% of aircraft are actually combat capable. It's closer to 25%. And now I'm sure that's way, way down. I mean, so that all those, again, we're coming up against these hard limits on the U.S. side. Now, the big question really, I think, for the Iranians is air defense. They demonstrated that they had it. They did strike that F-35. That's been confirmed. There was a report of hitting an F-15. I don't know if that's been confirmed or not. But that it is confirmed that they hit that F-35. And yeah, they don't have the kind of air defense that Russia has. Nobody does, outside of Russia. But they do have air defense, and it doesn't have to be 100% or even close to it. Even if it's 10%, if they can occasionally, strike an American aircraft, that's enough, because we have very little tolerance for that. I mean, that's just a really bad look. And, we do not want to be losing pilots and aircraft over Iran. So if just every once in a while they can strike an aircraft with their very mobile, rather simple but very effective air defense, they can keep, by and large, they can keep American aircraft out of their airspace, which makes a big difference, because that means if the Americans and the Israelis can't just fly over Iran unimpeded, that means that they can't drop the dumb bombs, of which there is almost an unlimited supply. That they will be forced to continue to perform these standoff strikes, and that it is dependent on missiles that are in very limited supply. And apparently, the stockpiles have really run down very rapidly over the last couple of weeks, and the amount of damage that they can do is very limited in that case. So this is a big question. It's just how effective Iranian air defense is, and I think that will. It won't necessarily determine the outcome of the war, but it will be if Iran can keep the Americans and the Israelis out of their airspace, their position is much stronger, and the Israelis and the Americans will essentially have to give up sooner. If they can't, and let's just look at a worst case scenario, and that the Americans and Israelis start to dominate the skies of Iran. They can start dropping dumb bombs. Well, remember, like in Vietnam, we dropped 7.5 million tons of bombs. In the end, we had to give up. It's still, it will mean that Iran will suffer greatly, but it doesn't mean that we can defeat them.
Yeah. I don't know how true this is, but I've been looking into some of the air defense stuff and what took down the F-35, and from what I've seen on like Chinese social commentary, and then also just some videos on X, that uh, what they have is almost it's like a semi-loitering missile. It flies in a large figure-8 pattern and it can stay up for a long time, and it's looking for heat signatures, and they have the heat signature of the F-35, and then when it gets close, the F-35 flies within range of it, then it goes off after it. And apparently, the F-35, they're not designed to really for this at all. They it's actually not even, they don't even detect the missile until it's almost too late. It's too close. So if this is true, that there's just this huge loophole in the F-35's design, that like, okay, yeah, it's hard to get seen by radar, but once you have the heat signature dialed in, that's all you can just look at that. And then this is a huge vulnerability. It's like, okay, well, I guess this, this thing isn't invulnerable or invisible. It's like you can see it has a massive jet engine. It produces lots of heat. They can see that and track that.
Right.
It's just, and we've spent like $1 trillion on this F-35 program. It's like it's insane. So, and now we might find like, oh, it's not, we can't even really use it. They can get shot down by a $50,000 missile or something like this.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it was also a Chinese source that described another. Yeah, that there is this drone, that is capable. We don't know how many of them they have. The Iranians have. It's something that they, I think, started developing fairly recently. So we don't know how far along that program is. But they do have also ground air defense. It's very small, mobile. You can hide it in a shed, and then when you have reason to believe that there is enemy aircraft in the area, you bring it out, and it doesn't use radar. Again, the problem, radar can see far, and it has those advantages, but it's also very visible to the enemy. Once you turn on the radar, they can detect the radar signals and go after it, right? So radar itself can be, is quite vulnerable. But they use this passive systems, like you say, heats, it's infrared. They're looking for the heat signature, and also just plain old, photo,
a visual.
Just visual imagery. Right. Exactly. Yeah. And again, that's passive. This doesn't actually produce any signal that's detectable by the enemy aircraft. So they go out, they get that they detect that there's an aircraft, they get the heat signature or maybe just the direct image, and they fire quickly, and then they can move the portable air defense system back into its hiding place, and I don't know what was used in the case of that F-35. I think it could have been one or the other. But apparently they do have both systems. And again, it's not fail safe, because the problem is, they don't have the radars that can detect the aircraft, from a distance away. So they don't know exactly what they're coming. But if they have a lot of these little ones, occasionally they'll get lucky. And I think that's all they need to be. Mm-hmm. If they're occasionally lucky, that's enough. If they can, every week or two, they hit an American or Israeli aircraft, I think that's more than we're really willing to tolerate.
Yeah, and they will get better the Iranians will get better over time on targeting these. It will be refined. It's just the nature of war. We see how it goes. Anybody that's been following the Ukraine war understands that as well, that, it takes a little while to develop, these heat signatures, these profiles. But once they do, they refine it, and then they can neutralize these systems pretty effectively. So that's what I predict what's going to happen. And I was just talking about that graph and seeing the massive uptick in drones and ballistic missiles being fired by Iran. I do know what's happening on the Israeli-U.S. side. Are we seeing a decline, that they are steady declining as they're running out of munitions? Stratotankers are being destroyed, the ability to continue these sorties for so long. We're talking about maintenance issues with these aircraft. Are we seeing just a steady decline in our ability to keep on striking Iran?
Yeah, I think we are. And that's what I hear. The sorties are way down, and that was expected. Remember, that was predicted by several people, including, Professor Ted Postol. He said, like, at the end of 1 or 2 weeks, and I think it was after 2 weeks that we began to see that. And it's definitely down right now. While Iranian strikes go up, we don't know how many missiles they have, but they have more than, already we know that they have more than what some people were claiming. There were some Israeli officials that said they maybe have a total of 2,500 missiles or whatever. Apparently they fired 3,000 already. So we don't know how many they have, but they have been preparing for a long time. They may have many tens of thousands. I'm sure they do. And the question is how many tens of thousands?
Right. I mentioned this before, but the more important thing isn't just how many they have in stockpiles. It's the productive capacity. And this is Chinese commentary as well that I've been reading. It's just saying that they can hold this up indefinitely. That, we know Iran has these massive missile cities. And now that they are in a war, that they're going to be able to ramp up production even more. They have inputs coming from China. They can expand their production capacity. And the U.S. and Israel can't. We see that. We've seen it. It's just amazing to me. The start of the Ukraine war, we notice, we have a massive problem with Patriot interceptors. We only make 650 a year. We got to bump this up. Let's try to double it. 4 years later, maybe we got an extra 50 a year. Maybe we're at 700. Like what's happened. We can't do it. So I think we are just in a huge bind here. And I think Iran's grand plan for all of this is that all they have to do is keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. Nothing the U.S. and Israel say or do can open it. And the longer they will keep on strangling the U.S. like that, and they will force the world to dump the dollar. We'll say okay, you want your oil? Here you go. Right. You use RMB. We're using Renminbi now. No more. And then and then it's over.
Right.
And the Chinese know this as well. I've been seeing just Chinese commentary talk about this. Like, we just have to sit around and wait. Don't have to do anything. And my buddy, shout out to Chris, he's probably listening. He sent me a video as well, just saying Iran's grand plan, and it was just it was from Rick and Morty, but just all he had to do was change the system, a value of 1 to 0. The dollar goes from 1 to 0, and all of a sudden the whole thing falls apart. Obviously, it's not going to go like that instantly, but that's more or less what is going to happen as the dollar becomes more and more, just irrelevant, and people dump it. Then everything here just collapses. The whole U.S. ability to project power, to sustain itself in any way, just disappears. And I think that's what's going to happen, is that it might happen fast. Once people start to see this, then it becomes, like a bank run. Everybody's just I got to get rid of these dollars fast. I don't want this. We got to move. A new world order is moving into place. If you wait too long to make the move, then you lose more. So you got to move quickly.
Right. Well, there have already been concrete developments, and to that end, I just saw a couple of reports that the Japanese had made a deal with the Iranians. They say, okay, we'll pay you in renminbi, and you just let some of our tankers through. Tankers going to Japan, and the Iranians said sure, and also pay us a fee of a certain amount, and the Japanese apparently agreed to it. Now, I don't know if that's been confirmed or not, but that's there. And I find it very believable in any case. And then on the question of the let's say the fragility of the dollar, we're seeing that actually right now. During past crises, there's always been this rush to the dollar. As we saw that in 2008. We've seen that again and again, over the last several decades. Again, the dollar was, regardless of what was happening, the U.S. was regarded as a sanctuary. The dollar in particular was regarded as a safe haven. And so even if there was, if the crisis was caused by the U.S., began in the U.S. as it did within the 2008 crisis, there was this huge rush to the dollar. And we got basically free money for that, and allowed us to survive those crises, to ride out of them, to continue to expand our economy. It's not happening this time. There isn't a rush to the dollar. This is, I think, a much greater crisis than any of the crises in the past over the last several decades. But interest rates have actually been rising. When you see that, when the yields on treasury bonds rise, that means that people are not buying them. Other countries, other central banks are not buying them, and then we have to make them more attractive by raising the interest rate. So that is a sign that, the dollar is in trouble, and that may be one of the casualties of this war.
Yeah. Do you think Iran understands that, and that is their plan? Like,
I
okay,
think they
let's do
do.
this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just like we're just going to keep this, um, we're going to maintain this chokehold here, and we're not letting go until we're satisfied with the situation. We're satisfied that we've really changed the balance of power within our region.
And
And
does
and
that
it's
mean a
clear on
dollar?
the American side that, especially Donald Trump, that he is panicking again. We just talked about this crazy ultimatum that he made, and then he obviously backed out of it. He's flailing. He's just doing whatever he can, and is making people notice that he makes these statements often to calm the markets just prior to the opening on Monday. And that's what he did again because he's terrified. And so for whatever reason, it actually does have the effect, but it's always a temporary effect. And then the markets begin to realize, hey, that's Donald Trump. I don't know why they're paying attention to him. But
Yeah.
anyway, they do. Sometimes it's a perception game. They know he's lying, but he said he told this lie. We know that it's going to drop. We'll sell right now. But then in a few days, it's going to go back up. And and eventually he's just going to lose control completely. He's just trying to talk his way out of it. And it's not going to work.
Right. He's the boy who cried wolf too much. People are going to stop believing him.
Yeah, that's yeah.
It's a little better.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't even try to bring it back in. Yeah. I something I also just was thinking about is just how impressive it is that Iran's been under such strict sanctions for so long. And perhaps in a way, they suffered greatly, but it was a blessing in disguise because it gave them resilience, it gave them independence, it gave them, they're able to sustain themselves. You already cut them off from the world and now you're attacking them. And then we find out that because they were under such, harsh sanctions, they couldn't get so many things, even things like medicine. Well, they had to learn how to do it themselves. And we saw Russia do the same thing, probably learning a lot from the Iranians before the start of this war. They realized, okay, we got to make sure we are okay with being sanctioned and cut off from the Western system. And you see that once again, that for them as well, once you do that, you all of a sudden, you're severed from just this, the teat of the U.S. empire, and you're able to sort of pursue your own civilizational path in a way. You were able to find your identity again. You're able to find some pride in your own industry, your own technologies. That's what we need. That's one of the beauties of the multipolar world. And it's one of the huge disadvantages of countries like Europe. It's like, okay, Europe, you just put everything in with the United States. What technology do you really have? What industry do you really have? What sovereignty do you really have? What anything do you have? Oh, it's just we just listen to Big Daddy Trump over here or the United States, and that's it. You have nothing. You forgot who you are. You don't know who you are as a people. You don't have, your culture gets eroded. Your everything does, And so I think in a way, it was, I don't think I don't obviously approve of the sanctions at all, but in a way it was kind of a blessing in disguise, I think, for Iran. And it also just led the West to believe that Iran they're isolated. They can't have any power because you're not part of our world, our system. So it led to that hubris as well.
Yeah. And one thing too is, by sanctioning them, and Iran and Russia now is, the two countries are in very similar situations. It deprives the West it deprives the U.S. in particular of leverage. They can't use the threat of sanctions anymore. He said, what other sanctions are you going to put on us? We don't care, obviously. We've learned we can live with them. The threats are gone, or have lost their power. So, yeah, no, I think that was very well put.
I think I'm really looking forward. Hopefully we can make it in the multipolar world. It's just going to be such a more rich and vibrant world. I lived in China for over 10 years, and it's interesting being in China because of the Great Firewall. They have their own technological ecosystem that is completely independent. And it's amazing the stuff that the Chinese have built. Just their systems and just using, WeChat and Alipay for everything is just so convenient. It just, the technology is very, very impressive. And then when I moved back to the United States, it did kind of feel like I was going back in time. I'm like, oh man, this sucks having to use these clunky systems here that are built in the West. But people in the West just assume that, oh, this is the best, that we got the best of everything. And then until you go to a country like China and be like, oh, there are other ways to do things. And if we allow a multipolar world, we can let all these countries do things their own way and learn from each other and share things with each other instead of just having one person dictate, you use this system, you use our system only, So
Right.
it will
Yeah.
be exciting if we
Well,
can make
I
it
think
there.
even more importantly, you're talking about civilizations. There's not just this one end of history, model of doing things. It has to be these certain institutions, free markets and a certain version of democracy and you know the LGBT stuff and all that. That's the package. That's what you accept. Everybody has to accept. Of course, you can eat your different foods or whatever, but when essence it comes to the things that really matter, we have to be the same. Multipolarity says no, we don't have to be the same. We may actually have fundamentally different values, but maybe we should just live with that and let each of us again develop in our own way.
Yeah. Well, I think Iran will have to thank them for ushering in the multipolar world. As an American, you always have conflicting things because you know that the pain is coming. When the dollar collapses, and this could happen. This could happen sooner than I think a lot of people realize. I think, like we said, Iran knows. They know the game plan. They got the U.S. just by the balls. Like they can't get out. And I think once the world started to see that, and then it's over. And then what's going to happen here in the United States? I mean, things are going to fall apart, but they have to. I just hope we don't get at each other's throats when it does. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I really don't. It's hard to predict those things. But yeah, we're going to be put under a lot of stress, and it's not clear that we're going to be able to hold up under that stress. We're not the same country that we were before. We've gone through severe crises in the past, but we survived them because there was a real faith in the institutions of this nation. But that faith has greatly eroded over the last few decades. And I think this time we're going to be faced with another great crisis. And I don't think that we're going to be able to survive it. We won't be able to weather the storm the way that we did in the past. I'm not going to predict the outcomes. It's so hard to do that. But we're in for rough and exciting times.
Do you think it pretty much is game, set, and match then? That we just have to, Iran has the U.S. at a chokehold, and they will win. The only question is, will we start lobbing nukes as in our last dying breath?
I think so. You never can be 100% certain. It's not impossible that the Iranian government could collapse, but we don't see any signs of that. It's not impossible that, let's say, the U.S. and Israel could degrade their missile capabilities to the point where they can't really threaten U.S. and Israeli interests, or military assets in the region. But again, we don't see any sign of that. And it looks like, all the very kind of bold and optimistic statements that are being made both by the Israelis and the U.S. so far have proven to be false. And pretty much what the Iranians were saying so far anyway have been proven to be true. So it looks like the Iranians are gaining control of the situation. Of course, they're suffering. We don't really even know how much they're suffering. I've noticed that that the civilian casualties or fatality statistics that they were publishing have remained frozen at 1,444 for many days right now. So they're, for whatever reason, they're not updating it. Clearly, there have been other civilian deaths. I've read about them, families that have been wiped out and so on. That's happening every day, but they're not updating their statistics. So we don't know how much they're suffering. The suffering is one thing. The suffering is really that's not how inflicting suffering on the civilians of your enemy is not the way you win a war. It just never has been. It wasn't even in World War II against the Japanese where we inflicted, horrific casualties. It wasn't just the nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It was, the firebombing of Tokyo and many other, very extensive bombing where you killed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. And I I think most historians agree that in the end, that even the nuclear bombs failed to persuade the Japanese to surrender. It was in fact the invasion of Manchukuo in the north by the Soviet Union, and that actually told them it was over. Again, it was a ground operation that did it. And we're talking about a grand operation, but the whole thing is a joke. We're talking about maybe 2,500 men total that will be put on an island, or they'll attempt to put them on an island. Or what is that going to do? The whole thing is a joke. I don't even know if they're really serious about that.
Yeah, I've even, I don't know how true this is, but I've heard that the people in the military are very upset. They're pushing. They're like, no, we're not doing this. Like, well, what's the objective? What's the plan here? How are we supposed to do this? So I hopefully there's enough pushback in the military and dissent. I mean, we heard about the USS Gerald Ford. Apparently, it's gone back for repair. They say 2 years or so for repairs. So that's quite a laundry room fire. I'm not sure if it was something more or what, but and if it was laundry room fire, then we know it was probably sabotage by these sailors. We've heard already rumors about them clogging the toilets, pulling out T-shirts and stuff out of these pipes, and so I just the West just has completely lost the narrative. It's crazy to see. It's very Trump, I guess. Just this wild tweeting, wasn't even 2 months ago, he's telling the Iranian people, help is on the way. And now he's threatening to wipe out everybody. No mercy, no quarter. It's like, what's going on here?
Yeah, no, he contradicts himself by the hour. It's really crazy. I mean, we've seen him do that before, but he got away with it because it was the sort of thing where he could pull back, without suffering any consequences. But he has really got himself in a mess here where it's I don't know how he can pull out of it. Let's just hope against hope that he manages to do it. It won't be that he can convince himself anyway that he can do it, that he can just walk away from it, and that people will believe that he achieved some great victory. I hope there are people whispering to him that, hey, you've done incredible things. Time just to leave and let the stupid Europeans clean it up. Just declare victory and go home. Of course, it'll be obvious that he was not victorious, but perhaps he can convince himself, or maybe some of the advisors can convince him that that's what could be done. That's the only thing I think we can hope for, as far as U.S. participation. But
yeah. So do you think there is a possibility that Trump could just pull out completely and just leave Israel by itself and say, sorry, we can't do it? Or that's not possible? We know that Israel just has way too much control.
Yeah, it would be very hard. It's not impossible. It's obviously not impossible. He could, but there will be, the problem is that all those Israel firsters, and we know there's so many of them and they have so much influence, and especially the kind of media that he watches, there will be howls of protest. It won't be typically people, his people line up whenever he does something. He does an about face. He completely contradicts himself, and they support him. They try to present the irrational as rational. They try to present, an obvious retreat as some sort of victory. But in this case, I doubt that they will, because again, there is such a commitment to Israel among these people. And if the Israelis are not happy about this, then he will fail in his attempt to proclaim victory. He'll fail in any case, but it'll be such a miserable failure that, even he will recognize it. So, yeah, I was just saying that there are people whispering in his ear. I hope there are people whispering in his ear, hey, you've done great things, time to get out of there. But, there are also people saying you can't leave. It's like you understand that you'll be betraying Israel, and you know what the consequences of that are.
Right. But the thing is, even if we stay, we can't protect Israel. That's what's being proven right now. That's the major thing that Iran has shown the world, that the U.S. in many ways is a paper tiger. And if you were watching the Ukraine war closely, you kind of already understood that. But because it was going through a proxy, we were able to hide it a bit more. Now that we're directly involved, it's like, okay, yeah, Our bases are wiped out. Our radars are wiped out. Our THAAD system doesn't work. The Patriot system doesn't work. The F-35 is not invisible. It can get targeted. Our stratotankers, our whole doctrine of air power is falling apart. Like our ability to project our power, through aircraft carriers and these aircraft and all these bases, is just sorties are going down. We're not even able to keep this tempo up. We can't even last a month. And we're crying. We started crying uncle after like 10 days. And then it just became this wishy-washy, oh, we've already won. Maybe we got to push a little harder. And it's so clear that we are in trouble. It is game, set, and match. Iran has this in the bag.
Yeah, it's looking that way. Again, there's nothing that's 100%, but that's the way it looks. Are
you happy about that? I am.
Of course. Yeah. Well, I was saying that for me, the true nightmare scenario is that the U.S. and Israel would just would succeed. They would that they would break apart Iran, and that once again, they would project this image of invincibility, and much of the world would just say, "Oh, I guess you just can't oppose these people. We just have to submit." I think that would be the nightmare scenario. Well, I guess another nightmare scenario. There's more than one nightmare scenario in this case. Of course, is nuclear war and nuclear strikes on Iran, and I think that remains a real possibility. I mean, I think that actually, with this recent strike on, Israeli strikes or Israeli-American strikes on Bushehr and then Natanz, and then the retaliation by the Iranians on Dimona, that we took a step, I would say a small step, but a step towards nuclear war.
Yeah. Scary. Well, just one last thing. I think, how would you explain to many Americans why they should be happy that Iran has got this in the bag? Because I think many Americans kind of will feel that, the instinct is obviously we just have to support us. And then I think a lot of the stance of many people now is like, I don't care about Israel, but I don't care about Iran. I just don't want to be part of this, why should we, even as Americans, be rooting for the country that our government is actively engaged in a war of aggression with?
Right. Well, because it's a war of an aggression. It's a war that was not in our interest. It's a war that we never should have launched. It was a war carried out by, an establishment, a political class in this country that does not have our interests at heart. And so we should not wish them success. For the sake of America, we want them to fail and to actually come home and start addressing, the problems that are here, rather than creating problems for us, real costs in both blood and treasure with these wars. Again, I talked about those treasury bonds. Again, that sounds rather abstract, but that means something. Those interest rates on the treasury bonds are going to have an impact on mortgage rates, for example. And the dollar, we've talked about the consequence of these absurd, let's say, geopolitical projects, both Ukraine and the Zionist project in the Middle East, the negative consequences that they're having on the dollar. I think probably a lot of people don't understand that. They ignore that. It sounds kind of boring, but it's real, and you're going to be feeling it soon. Again, it's a consequence of this crazy war. So even if you're just looking at your naked self-interest, you should be hoping that we just get out of this as soon as possible, that we never did it, and that at least we learn that we should never do this again.
Right. Yeah, the economic pain is going to wake up a lot of people, but then also I think the moral part of it. I think many people see Iran is fighting on behalf of all of us to free the West from the Epstein class, free us from this horrific Zionist tyranny, or Neocon tyranny, whatever you wanted to call it. That's what they're doing. And so, thank you, Iran. It's just insane. I think anybody that looks at our government and see how it's behaving and can look at these, the Epstein files and everything else that's going on, and I think many people understand. And maybe if they don't understand now, like you said, once the economic pain starts to hit, they'll start to look, and it's easy to find. We know what's going on now, and so yeah. Thank you, Iran. Let's hope that nukes don't fly, though.
Yeah.
We'll see. Okay. Have a good rest of your day, Dad.
Okay, you too.
I'll talk to you soon. Okay,
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.